So, chapter 9. Remember what happened in chapter 8? In the beaver's house, they had a nice big supper, and then they sat around listening to all the Mr. and Mrs. Beaver had to tell them, tell the four kids. And then they discovered Edmund was missing. And now, of course, chapter 9 in the witch's house. And now, of course, you want to know what happened to Edmund. Well, he had eaten his share of the dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking all the time about Turkish delight. And there's nothing that spoils the good, ordinary taste of food half as much as the bad magic food memories. And he'd heard the conversation between everyone and hadn't enjoyed that much either, because he kept on thinking that the others were, taking no notice of him and trying to give him the cold shoulder. They weren't doing that, but he imagined it. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan, and until he had heard the whole arrangement for meeting Aslan at the stone table. Then he began very quietly to edge himself under the curtain that hung over the door. The mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Just as Mr. Beaver had been repeating the rhyme about Adam's flesh and Adam's bone, Edmund had been very quietly turning the door handle. And just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling them that the White Witch wasn't really a human at all, but half a djinn and half a giantess, Edmund had got outside into the snow and cautiously closed the door behind him. Now, you mustn't think that even now Edmund was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brother and sisters to be turned into stone. He did want Turkish delight, and he wanted to be a prince and later a king, and of course to pay Peter out for calling him a beast. But as for what the witch would do with the others, he didn't want her to be particularly nice to them. Certainly not put them on the same level as himself, but he managed to believe, or at least to pretend he believed, that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them because, well, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't true. She was jolly nice to me anyway, much nicer than they are. I expect she is the rightful queen, really, and anyway she'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least, those were the excuses he made up in his own mind for what he was doing. They weren't very good excuses, were they? But deep down inside of him, he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. The first thing he realized when he got outside and found snow falling all around him was that he'd left his coat inside the beaver's house. And now, of course, there was no chance of going back to get it. The next thing he realized was that daylight was almost gone. It had been nearly 3 o'clock when they sat down to dinner, and winter days were short. He hadn't reckoned on any of this, but he had to make the best of it. So he turned up his collar and shuffled across the dam. Luckily, it wasn't so slippery since the snow had fallen, and he got to the far side of the river. It was pretty bad when he reached the far side. It was growing darker every minute, and what with that and the snowflakes swirling all around him, he could hardly see 3 feet ahead. And then, too, there was no road. He kept slipping into drifts of snow and skidding on frozen puddles and tripping over fallen tree trunks and sliding down steep banks and barking his shins against rocks till he was wet and cold and bruised all over. The silence and the loneliness were dreadful. In fact, I really think he might have given up the whole plan and gone back and owned up to what he'd done and made friends with the others if only he hadn't happened to say to himself, when I'm king of Narnia, the first thing I will do will be to make some decent roads. And of course that set him off thinking about being a king and all the other things he would do, and this cheered him up quite a good deal. He had just settled in his mind what sort of palace he would have and how many cars and all about his private movie house and where the principal railways would run and the laws he would make against beavers and dams, and he was putting the finishing touches to some schemes for keeping Peter in his place when the weather changed. First the snow stopped. Then a wind sprang up and it became freezing cold. Finally, the wind pushed the clouds away and the moon came out. It was a full moon, and shining on all that snow, it made everything almost as bright as day, only the shadows were maybe a little confusing. He would never have found his way if the moon hadn't come out by the time he got to the other river. You remember they had seen when they first arrived at the beavers' place a smaller river flowing into the big river. You remember that? And he reached that little river now, and he turned to follow it up. But the little valley down which that river came was much steeper and rockier than the one he had just left, and it was so overgrown with bushes. He wouldn't have been able to manage it at all in the dark if it wasn't for the moon. Even as it was, he got wet through and through, for he had to stoop under branches, and great loads of snow came sliding onto his back. And well, every time this happened, he thought more and more how he hated Peter, just as if this was all Peter's fault. But at last he came to a part where it was more level, and the valley opened out, and there, on the other side of the river, quite close to him actually, in the middle of a little plain between two hills, he saw what must be the witch's house. And the moon was shining brighter than ever. The house was really a small castle. It seemed to be all towers, little towers with long pointed spires on them, sharp as needles. They looked like huge dunce caps or sorcerer's caps, and they shone in the moonlight, and their long shadows looked strange on the snow. And Edmund started to feel just a little bit afraid of the house. But it was too late to even think about turning back now, so he crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring, not the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on this deeply fallen snow. He walked on and on, past corner after corner of the house, and past turret after turret, looking to find the door. He had to go right around to the far side before he found it. It was a huge arch, but the great iron gates stood wide open. Edmund crept up to the arch and looked inside into the courtyard, and there he saw a sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched just as if it was ready to spring and catch something. And Edmund stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on, and still afraid to go back. He didn't know what to do. His knees were knocking together. He stood there so long that his teeth would have begun chattering with cold, even if they hadn't been chattering with fear. How long this really lasted, I don't know. It seemed to Edmund to last for hours. Then at last he began to wonder, hey, why is the lion standing so still? For it hadn't moved 1 inch since he first set eyes on it. So Edmund now ventured a little nearer, still keeping in the shadows of the arch as much as he could. And he now saw from the way the lion was standing that it couldn't have been looking at him at all. But he didn't know what would happen if it turned its head, thought Edmund. In fact, it was staring at something else, namely a little dwarf who stood with his back to the lion about 4 feet away. Aha, thought Edmund, when it jumps at that dwarf, then will be my chance to escape. But still the lion never moved, nor did the dwarf. And now at last Edmund remembered what the others had said about the white witch turning people into stone. Perhaps this was only a stone lion. And as soon as he thought of that, he noticed that the lion's back and the top of its head were all covered with snow. Of course, it must only be a statue, he thought. No living animal would let itself get covered with snow. Then very slowly, and with his heart beating as if it would burst, Edmund ventured to go up to the lion. Even now he hardly dared to touch it, but at last he slowly reached out his hand and very quickly touched it. Ha! It was cold stone. He had been frightened of a mere stone statue. The relief that Edmund felt was so great that in spite of the cold, he suddenly got warm all over, right down to his toes. And at the same time, there came into his head what seemed like a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is the great lion Aslan they were all talking about. She's caught him, turned him into stone, And that's the end of all their fine ideas about him. Poof! Who's afraid of Aslan, he thought. And he stood there gloating over the stone lion, and presently he did something actually very silly and childish. He took a stump of lead pencil out of his pocket and scribbled a mustache on the lion's upper lip. Then he drew a pair of glasses on his eyes. And he said, "Yeah, silly old Aslan, how do you like being a stone? You thought yourself mighty fine, didn't you?" But in spite of the scribbles on its face, the great stone beast still looked so terrible and sad and noble, staring up in the moonlight that Edmund didn't really get any fun out of jeering it at all. He turned away and began to cross the courtyard towards the front door. As he got into the middle of it, he saw that there were dozens and dozens of statues all around, standing here and there, rather like the pieces of the chessmen standing on a chessboard when it's halfway through the game. There were stone satyrs and stone wolves and bears and foxes and catamountains of stone. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but who were really the spirits of trees. There was the great shape of a centaur and a winged horse and a long, lithe creature that Edmund took to be a dragon. They all looked so strange, standing there, perfectly lifelike and also perfectly still. In the bright, cold moonlight, it was eerie work crossing the courtyard. Right in the very middle stood a huge shape like a man, but as tall as a tree, with a fierce face and a shaggy beard and a great big club in his right hand. Even though he knew it was only a stone giant and not a live one, Edmund did not like going past it. He now saw that there was a dim light showing from the doorway on the far side of the courtyard. He continued to go and went up to it. There was a flight of stone steps going up to an open door. Edmund went up them, and across the threshold lay a great wolf. "It's all right," he kept saying it to himself. "It's all right, it's all right. It's only a stone wolf. It can't hurt me. It's all right." And as he raised his leg to step over it, instantly the huge creature rose up. With all the hair bristling along its back, he opened a great red mouth and said in a growling voice, "Who's there? Who's there? Stand still, stranger, and tell me who you are." "Well, if you please, sir," said Edmund, trembling so that he could hardly speak. My name is Edmund, and I'm the son of Adam that Her Majesty met in the woods the other day. And, well, I've come to bring her news that my brother and sister are now in Narnia, quite close, actually, in the beaver's house. She wanted to see them." "I will tell Her Majesty," said the wolf. "Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold as you value your life." Then it vanished into the house. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold and his heart pounding in his chest. And pretty soon the gray wolf, his name was Mogrim, the chief of the witches' secret police, came bounding back and said, come in, fortune, favorite of the queen, or maybe not so fortunate." And Edmund went in, taking great care not to step on the wolf's paws. He found himself in a long, gloomy hall with many pillars, full as the courtyard had been of statues. The one nearest the door was a little fawn with a very sad expression on its face, and Edmund couldn't help wondering if this might be Lucy's friend. You remember him? His name was Tumnus. The only light came from a single lamp, and close beside this sat the White Witch. I'm coming, Your Majesty," said Edmund, rushing eagerly forward. "How dare you come alone?" said the witch in a terrible voice. "Did I not tell you to bring the others with you?" Please, Your Majesty," said Edmund. "Well, I've done the best I can. I brought them quite close, actually. They're in the little house on top of the dam just up the river with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver." A slow, cruel smile came over the witch's face. "Is this all your news?" she asked. No, Your Majesty," said Edmund, and proceeded to tell her all that he had heard before leaving the beaver's house. "What, Aslan?" cried the queen. "Aslan, is this true? If I find you have lied to me—" Please, I'm only repeating what they said," stammered Edmund. But the queen, who was no longer even listening to him, clapped her hands, and instantly the same dwarf that Edmund had seen with her before, remember driving the sled, he all of a sudden appeared. "Make ready our sledge," ordered the witch, "and use the harness without bells." And that's the end of chapter 9. So it's getting pretty tense. Do you want to know what chapter 10 is called? The spell begins to break. Okay. You have a nice evening, and I'll see you